Hey everybody, Javan Bernakevitch here with All Points Design. That's allpointsdesign.ca and Neil Bertrando of RT Permaculture. Today we're talking about the Oregon State University Permaculture Design course. Specifically, we're talking about Assignment 13, the Plant Guild Design Assignment. Now, Neil and I were just joking that in this video series, we're definitely asking for more of you than what the assignments are asking. And in this assignment particularly, we want you to be very cognizant of that. The assignment itself, guild centered around at least two species, identified proposed plantings, plants drawn in relative size, narrative explanation, explain ecological function of each plant, explain how plants will maintain over time, north arrow, quality, like all of those are great, good, awesome. We are coming at this from a design perspective. We're coming at this from a perspective of we've been doing this for, Neil, how long you been doing this?
12, 13 years, something like that.
I'm at 10. So, we've got 20 years playing with this space. And while this is a wonderful thing to learn in this way, we want to take you that next step so it's as useful as possible. Neil, thoughts to add to that?
Yeah. So there's a lot of detail and depth that can go into guild design and analysis. And so this is a first run through for you. We don't expect you to go into all that depth, but we also want to bring up some important patterns to be looking for and things that manifest over time, which, when you're planting long-term type of species, those are the things that can get you, the things that are consistent over time, not the initial planting and layout and installation.
Yeah, great point. So as we're going through this assignment, we're going to be talking kind of in a greater conversation, as Neil was talking about, in terms of harvesting, maintenance, layout, how do you access, how do you get in, how do you get out, does it actually work on the broad scale? I love what Toby Hemingway brought us with the idea of guild design, of putting different types of species together, and folks like Mark Shepard and Darren Doherty have expanded upon that in the broad scale about how do you take as much solar real estate, as well as Stefan Stobanowski out of the Permaculture Orchard or Miracle Farms in Quebec. But all of those things together, we really need to take the concept, which is really well put together in Toby's guild, the concept of multiple layers, of using space, of having compatibility, and add to that what ends up being in reality the functionality of access, the functionality of harvesting, the functionality of sightlines. Sightlines are a huge one. I remember a job I did up in Yellow Point on Vancouver Island, where we went up to the client's office that was looking out over the hill, and we chose the species of trees so that way at top maturity you would still be able to see the ocean and still have all the functionality and the food that they wanted to, and they still wanted to hit farm status by only selling at the mailboxes, really specific pieces about design. But all those things come into practice and play when you start playing with guild design on the broad scale. And I want to encourage people not just to pick the tree and do the simple guild, but I want to encourage you to say, okay, if you have a broad scale property, work on the broad scale, work on 2 or 3 species that seem like they'll go well in pattern, going across either contour, off contour, a key line pattern, whatever it might be, whatever suits your site. But really take in the idea that there are multiple places, multiple angles, multiple considerations, and it's not just one tree and some species around it. It's really a concept for a much bigger conversation about productivity when it comes to vegetation.
I totally agree. I think one of the critical components is to remember that permaculture design is case sensitive and site specific, and that we're working from pattern to detail. So if you're on a small site and you have a place for one tree and a few shrubs and some herbs, then Toby's layout is potentially a practical one. But as soon as you start to scale up and you're integrating pattern levels like windbreak, view screen, solar bowl, alley cropping, other sorts of production systems, then finding the guilds that fit the pattern and provide for those additional aspects of access, management, maintenance over time are really important. And I think Toby also does a great job in graphically and conceptually presenting many or all of the options, both structurally in the vertical and horizontal layers of the plants, as well as functionally in the ecological functions the different plants provide. And what we also want you to integrate are the human energy flows and the sector energy flows and how the guild interacts with those. So that's where the access, harvest, maintenance, all that sort of stuff comes in. And I'm not clear that that's well described in much of the guild literature.
Good points. Well, let's jump into a couple of examples so folks can get a sense of what we're looking at here. So one of the things I want to show first and foremost is a brilliant example. And again, this is a high level of graphic rendering, both in the hand drawing, but also a hybrid. And this is the cool thing about working with digital, is that you can do quite a bit of hybrid. First and foremost, we have a narrative talking about why the two areas were chosen. So the area of the complete design guild, the area of the specific design guild, speaking a little about why that is and where that is. And then we get into the specifics. And again, don't be put off by how they put this all together. One thing they did, which I really appreciate, is they put in a very specific type of canopy color for existing. So you can see that the existing has a transparency to it. It has a shadow to it. So I'm really clear on what is existing and what is proposed. This is something that I find a lot of people skip, and it leads to a lot of confusion. So you need to be able to delineate what already exists and what you're proposing. This again being a plan view, it shows us all of the different specifics on what's being planted, the types even. So taking a look at a comfrey, a Bocking 14, which is a seed sterile species of comfrey, cultivar actually. Taking a look at some of the areas of the bench and the pathways, really giving us a sense of all of this. And then pulling away the background, pulling away everything else. So it's a grayscale, or in this, even a simple line drawing so we can see everything, really helps to pop the guild and let me see what's going on here. Then we get into a secondary guild where they've decided to go really specific. They've gone tight and brought out a number of the specifics here. So they've done the major trees again with this heavy line set, and they've labeled them with letters. And then they've gone in with the other plants and they've labeled them with numbers. So again, I'm very clear on what's existing and what's proposed. And throughout this, they've also, to a certain extent, tried to color code some of the colors here: wild strawberry for red, comfrey for a type of green, boards for a light blue, purple coneflower with a light purple. Really nice to see that. This is very legible, very easy to understand. Sometimes trying to be all things to all people, I find a lot of people say, well, if we're going to include mushrooms, we're just going to throw a mushroom log in. I want to caution that that's not always the most site specific and applicable. Sometimes it's actually inoculating pathways, doing sunken pathways, using your pathways as some of your water distribution, and then filling that up with wood mulch that's then inoculated. It's a very common strategy that I've used in the urban environment to bring water, but also to build soil and to have a cropped pathway, to have the pathway actually cropped into mushrooms. We used Stropharia rusolata, the garden wine mushroom, a lot for that. And then a side render. Side renders are really important because it lets me know that you understand that height is a variability. And they did what I love is they showed me roots as well. I would love if you did that. I would love if you put the time and energy to show me that you get a sense of what the root depths are looking like, which means that this might be a little bit up, as this one is, but really gives us a good sense of this guild, what it looks like from a rendering point. They've given us a north arrow up here, as you can see, so you have a good sense of where this is structurally in the property. They could have added some of the education we've had in the elevation assignment and given me an A and a B and given me a small map here to show me exactly where the property this is. That would have been nice. Again, distances in meters. They've given me a scale. Fantastic. Always had a title block here. They did a real specific and unique title block, always numbering as they went along. Just lots of great things here. Now, again, do you have to have this type of artistry to do this? No. Could you draw a circle and color it in with green and call it good? Yeah. No problems. And Neil and I have both started there, and that's where those conversations begin. But these were all really exceptional ways of showing these processes. And then they took that next step and they gave me a wonderful list of the plants in the guild. So they gave me the layer it was in, the scientific name, the common name, the functions that it provided, gave me all of those. Again, this is probably above and beyond, but I'd love if this was standard. I'm not going to lie. And I don't mean, again, I do not mean the quality of the drawing. I mean the specifics. Give me all the plants. Show me what's existing. Show me what's proposed. Make sure the background fades away so the guild pops out. Give me a sense of where it is on the entire property. Don't just punch in here because now I'm going to have to search for it. Give me the big picture. Give me the small picture. Give me the detailed picture. Give me another detailed picture if you're doing two, and that's what you want to do, which is fantastic. Let me know where all the plants are. Color code with color in mind. Give me at least one render. And then do give me the plants. Let me know what's going on here. I want to know that you've gone through the mental work, and we've talked about this before, but the big work that we do in this type of land design work is diagnosis, and diagnosing if plants work on site, if they're compatible with each other, if they're compatible as well, if they're compatible with the amount of time and energy the client has to maintain this structure. I've seen so many designs put in, and at harvest time, at maturity, 2 or 3 years later, they give up, they yank it out, they put in line because it was too much work to harvest, because there was too much harvesting. So those are all really good specific questions, case specific to your clients. And if it's you, you got to ask yourself some hard questions. And if you can't do it, get somebody else to ask you the questions. Do you really want to be harvesting for 3 months straight from July, August, September, maybe a little bit of October? Is that what you want? Got to ask yourself these questions, because this is about real life applications. And I think a lot of people like to think that this is just playtime. As soon as you put a plant in the ground, it's not playtime. It's something that's living and breathing. And just like a pet, I'd like to see some responsibility about what we put into the ground and helping it come to fruition. And we can always pull it out and we can always change, but really take on that burden of the designer, that it is our burden to put in good design and to make sure that the design does what it's supposed to do. Neil?
Yeah, oh, well, I'm just going to riff on that a little bit. Remember that one of the Estonian principles is everything gardens. So as soon as you put something in the ground, it's going to change the environment around it. It's going to start responding and growing and adapting, and other things are going to change based on that. So that's an important thing to consider, as well as that you are taking some responsibility for it, right? If you're going to go ahead and plant something, well, why? It takes energy, so there should be some intention behind it. Now, into the specifics of the assignment, I'll start with what we're on right here, which is the cross section. It shows a good equal 1-to-1 vertical to horizontal ratio. You can see that clearly, which is another reason why we've been reinforcing that, is that it's a very valuable tool to look at and assess plant guild design and other site design layout pieces, both in detail and at scale. One thing is that this is, obviously, if you look at this and then you look at the render of the plan view, that they've included many depths of the cross section in this cross sectional rendering. So that's a challenge, because it doesn't actually allow me to understand the lateral relationships between the plants. So from this cross section, it looks like there's not really any space to get in there and do anything. Like if I was going to try to walk in there and manage or harvest or do anything, I would be totally restricted. I'd have branches in my face. I wouldn't be able to do much of it. It would be kind of frustrating, and I probably wouldn't do it. So that's another thing that we want to consider, is you want to be able to have the maintenance be something that you enjoy doing. So putting a person in there, yep. And that's just on the edge. What if I was right in the center? But by the time I got to the center, I don't think I'd have a bucket in my hand for harvesting anymore. And I would basically just be struggling to get out, or I'd have to cut my way out with my loppers. But if we look at the plan view, it isn't as crowded as this makes it seem. So as a communication tool for what they've included, I think that's great. But as a design analysis tool for understanding how the guild functions, it's not quite as useful for me to try and understand and project how I'm going to actually work within this sort of guild. So putting an actual line across section where you're actually taking it and only rendering the plants that are in that, and maybe doing a few, is valuable. Even this close-up, though, I question if it's just a little bit too closely packed with too many layers. One thing I really do like about it a lot is that you can see along the bottom line there's shrub 444, the blueberries. They're grouped. They're outside of the layer of the tree, the major canopy tree. And then number 6, wild strawberry. So there's a huge groupings of number 6 all throughout, and that's basically the ground cover they're using. I might just rely upon that, or like a couple different ground covers at different areas, like 5 lupin. Might be a little big under there, but you want to make it easy to get in and manage around your trees. So not having a shrub like number 3, the gumi, under that tree would probably make it easier, because gumis can actually get relatively large. I think they'll be larger than how they're represented there, would be my guess, actually.
And just to touch on that as you're speaking about it, Neil, so if we take a look at gumi specifically, we've got at least 3 that I see here. So we've got one directly underneath the tree, which I think both you and I would say is probably a big no-no. We've got one that's straddling the drip line, which is usually where I'd like to see something like that, maybe a little bit further outside. And that's exactly where we've got this gumi, which is helping to straddle both C, the pawpaw, and B, the Japanese persimmon. So it can provide that double service between the two. And even if I was to critique it, I might say that if we took out the black currant here and put a gumi here and a gumi here, now we've got potentially some redundancy for nitrogen fixation. Just something to add there as you're going through.
Totally. Yep. Yeah, and that gives you that space if it was just, for example, wild strawberry under the canopy of the big trees, and then outside the canopy slightly you have some nitrogen fixing support, and then you have a hedgerow of fruiting shrubs like the blueberries a little bit further outside, so you can walk between the trees and the shrubs easily. Mm-hmm. That simplifies this a lot. It doesn't have quite the glamour of this field design, but it has, I think, a more robust functionality. So one of the challenges with the permaculture concept is there's so many amazing things and so much exciting opportunity to design and play and put these things together, kind of like both from a creative standpoint. There's also the functional kind of puzzle aspect of it, of how is it actually going to work when you actually start working with it in the managed landscape. And that aspect to me is more mechanical, and one of the kind of design principles I come back to from that perspective is the thing that provides the desired function with the fewest amount of parts is the optimal design. So you don't necessarily need to add in 15 or 17 things. 4 or 5 things well placed so that they can be easily managed and work together harmoniously to provide the functions you want is a very solid build design, in my opinion. I usually strive for like 2 to 4 layers rather than hitting 7.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the biggest thing I've learned, is that the least I do, the better the design is. So not the 101 things, but 1 or 2 simple conversations that exponentially take a site up. And the only way I've been able to get to that level of detail is to be very specific and take really long scopes of observation, ask lots of questions, to look into a lot of inquiry, be it from a regional perspective to a municipal perspective to a local perspective, to speak to everybody and their dog, to really understand the site. And Neil and I talked about this a couple of years ago, that more and more we want to be on site 2, 3, 4 times over 2, 3, 4 seasons, and hopefully multiple seasons. And that's one of the interesting things that I've done in my design work, is that I've told clients this is probably a 1 to 2 year process. You're going to see me lots of times on site. We're going to have lots of conversations. We're going to talk to everybody and their dog, because we want to really understand that Venn diagram of what you have, what you're excited about, what makes you come alive, with what the site can provide, with what are some of the climatic factors, both from a regulatory standpoint and from an abiotic standpoint. So understanding those 3 together, that overlap, is what emerges from design. And I'll finish with this and let Neil pick it back up, is that design should emerge. It should not be forced, or it should not be applied. So design should emerge out of the observations. If you get to a place to where you're looking at a site that is dry, is sandy, is in a place that is very difficult to be watered, the thought shouldn't be, well, I have to put something here. The thought should be, is this site telling me it's a perfect place to store mechanical equipment that won't have grass grow up into it? Because that might be it. there's something about this doing mind that is problematic, I think, in humanity on the scale. But specifically in permaculture, you take that doing mind into this, and all of a sudden, as what was it, Jim Brown, the great American tracker called it? What's the loudest thing in the forest? The human mind. What does it sound like? A trash can going down a suburban alley at 3:00 in the morning. So instead of being in that state of observation and seeing what we're seeing, it's, well, what could I do here? And what could go over there? And some of the best advice I was ever given is to observe a site from about 3 feet tall as if you were a small child and ask the most important question possible. And that most important question is, what's going on here? Before I touch anything, what is happening all by itself? What wants to happen? What is wanting to be created? Before I start saying, well, I got to gild it, because that's what permaculture said. What's happening here, and can I add, or is my sheer presence of walking into this scape an interruption? And if it is, then the best design option, the best thing you can do for that site is to retrace your steps as slowly as possible and let the site do what it needs to do. But that's a bit of a rant, and I told myself I wasn't going to rant in any of these videos, but it happened. So there we are.
Well, I'll riff on that. Doing nothing is a management decision, and sometimes it's a good one. So it's good to have it on the table.
Yeah.
And one of the questions is, I always like to try and apply the 5 whys to my, thought process. Why am I doing this? Why am I doing this? And just, whatever your answer is, ask why again. And that helps you get down to kind of the root cause, and just to do a quality control check on yourself, because it's easy to start down a rabbit hole and get tunnel vision. Like, I want to have perennial harvest all year long. Do I really want to have that? Like, what will it take to do that? How will that change what I'm doing now versus, what I would be doing then?
Yeah.
And or, what am I doing now that I don't like doing? How could I design a guild that would eliminate that?
Yeah.
And allow me to do something that I do like doing. So some questions like that, rather than how can I fill all the space?
Yeah.
Can you scroll up a little bit to the plan view, the bigger render? Yeah, that one. So I really like this, what they've done here with the guild design centered inside of this kind of like street area. And in particular, from a guild design and layout standpoint, they've got several paths. I would make the paths bigger, most likely. I find that paths are almost always designed too small. The vegetation will grow up around it and crowd it. So bigger is better from a path perspective in my standpoint, unless you're doing like an intensive market garden and you have designed them specifically to manage your flow through and harvest and stuff like that. But from a perennial garden, I guarantee your plants are going to get big and crowd your paths if you're not careful. And then you have to cut them back. So now you have work to maintain a path that you can use to do more work. Whether that's joyous work like harvest or not, it still ends up being work. So, but what I like they've done here is they've clustered their raspberries in a row along the path. They've put some ground cover around that and left some space because they're probably going to expand. They've clustered their blueberries in one area where they can go when it's time to harvest blueberries and easily harvest them, or when it's time to prune them and do the consistent pruning on all of them. They don't have to go to 8 different spots to prune their blueberry bushes. Same with their raspberries. It looks like black currant or something, that little purple bush that's scattered through underneath. That's spread out. That would probably be much happier in a hedge in general also, and easier to maintain and manage, and easier to propagate if you wanted to grow out and spread it as well. So those are some of the things I see here that I like and don't like.
I think we could probably stick on this one for the rest of the time, but I would like to bring up a couple of the other examples because I think there's some application here. And one of them is renovation. So for a lot of folks, renovation is probably going to be something that they'll be dealing with, being that there's an existing conversation, there's an existing conventional agricultural system that's in play, and they want to amend, they want to augment, they want to have some pieces work within it. So this was a blueberry field. It was a U-pick op, about 1,000 blueberry plants divided into a 100 by 50 foot patch and a 30 by 15. And this was really about, for their guild assignment, building functionality around these blueberries. So characteristics, starting off with analysis of an element. Blueberries like acidic soil and full sun. root structure shallow. They don't like to compete at the same horizon. Shock of shocker, newsflash, most plants don't. They need lots of water in the summer, 2.5 centimeter a week. Irrigation is a must. The system is in place. Everything's in place for this to do really well. Okay, great. Awesome. So we got a good sense of that. Now, so the intent is to transfer the portion of the farm from the blueberry field to the berry zone. So now we've got multiple types of berries that might work. Incorporate other berry varieties and cousins to expand, create a sun tract to catch all the southwest sun, but do not share the blueberry fields. Create a third experimental field to grow several varieties. Okay, so what we see now is we see a very specific, very broad scale conversation, right? Pulled way back. I am a bit of a mulberry addict. So my name's Javan. I'm addicted to mulberries. And in speaking with Raul, we talked about this, and we talked about the fact that there is a great local market. Blueberries tend to be very perishable, so you can't take them too far, but when people realize the taste of them, they will come. And then working in with gojis and autumn olive. One of the things here, just from a structural perspective, you don't need that many autumn olives for that many gojis, and I would probably put them in between the mulberries instead, working more with Stefan Stobanowski's work of the nap planting. So nap being N is a nitrogen fixer, A is an apple, P is a pear or plum, and then you start again with the nitrogen fixer. So the revision of this assignment showed that out. They put in their raspberries, they decided to do an underplanting of strawberries within the blueberries, which with the first tests a couple years later turned out actually really good. I was highly skeptical that it was going to work, but there it is. They worked with some June strawberries. They worked with some evergreen strawberries, some currants and gooseberries. So they decided to make a whole new expanded field and really create that sun trap. And that's what we see here. So I'm just going to throw on the good old draw tool and pull that out. So we really see that here. We've got a nice sun trap that does start to increase the heat in this entire sector. So that was a brilliant move in conversation, which I really appreciated. They also saw that there's a few other places that they could start to increase the number of irrigation ponds on site and pull that conversation out a bit more. Gave us a sense of the guild layers. I don't think, if I'm correct here, I don't think they gave us a render, which is fine. I wouldn't have mind seeing one so I could understand exactly what they were doing. Just to give you guys a sense, a couple of cross sections I think that would probably have been good is giving me something like that. I would have liked to have seen what that looks like all the way across, or maybe more specifically something like that. There we go. And probably something across here so I get a sense of what this looks like. Those would have been nice renders to see, even specific, like quick little sketches. They don't have to be beautiful or perfect at all. They do have to be accurate. Those would have been nice to see. But generally, this is a sense of what gilding, quote unquote, gilding looks like on the broad scale. It looks like trying to create perennial polyculture. And as Mark Shepard has said, if you've got an acre that has 4 or 5 species, yes, they don't all produce that same amount every single year in the same quantity as if you had the entire acre, but they do provide something that's really important in this day and age, which is resiliency. If one sector of plants or grouping of plants doesn't necessarily produce this year because of X, Y, or Z, too much water, too little water, too much sun, not enough sun, hurricane comes through, tornado comes through, flood comes through, there's another sector of plants, a grouping of plants, we use sector for something else, grouping of plants that's going to pick up the slack and still provide some income and some productivity. So really do think about that. In a changing climate, it's really important to cover our bases.
Great. So I have a lot of comments on this. I think it's a really awesome example. If you look at the first picture, I want everyone to just understand that the blueberries are already gilded, right? The blueberries are gilded with grass pasture, and there may be forbs and other stuff in that. So, that started at the starting point, right? They don't actually state that in their starting point. So I think that's an important thing to consider, is that there's already 2 layers. There's already existing gild that has specific maintenance and management requirements, right? And sometimes, you can just shift the pasture, right? Interseeding with clover, nitrogen fixing cover crop that's a species that's appropriate to the area would be a great gild opportunity for this. It would shift the existing gild, not change any of the management except for putting the work into getting the clover established, and allow increased functionality of both flowering, habitat for bees and pollinators and predators, as well as nitrogen fixation. So very, very simple way to take something that's existing and just do an analysis of what's there and slightly tweaking what's there. A lot of times that's going to be as much as we need to move to the next step, either decreasing costs or increasing ecological and site functionality. So the next page, where you have the plan view, building on their intent, which I also think is really critical. Why are you gilding? What's the point of doing the gild? State your intent, right? What do you want to get out of it? They've done something I noticed here, which I thought was phenomenal. When do they harvest the blueberry fields? They harvest in July and August, right? And they list when they're doing it, when they're harvesting the raspberries. Then when do they harvest the ground cover that they integrated, the strawberries, which I also would be cautious of as Javan was, but it sounds like it worked out great. So that's awesome. And part of that is because they listed, well, they do June strawberries. So they harvest those in June, right? So that diversifies their income stream as well as spreads out their labor in the field. It also means that they're going to be in the field. Now the question is, do they have to prune the blueberries in June? Hopefully they do that before then, right? So thinking through all your activities on a calendar scale to make sure that you're not adding in work when you're already full of work is important when you're considering your guild, especially at a farm or commercial scale. One thing that is kind of a pet peeve for me is, in general, if I'm going to do something like a big planting of mulberries, I would plant in blocks and not just checkerboard, one and then another type of pattern. So for me, I would want to do a block of black mulberries, 5 or 6, and then a block of white mulberries, 5 or 6, and so on and so forth, and stagger it along that, or maybe just one section that's black and one section that's white, depending on where they're a little bit more suited to. The black like the heat and don't tolerate the cold as much. So if there's a cold or frost drainage, and I'd put the white mulberries in that sector, that sort of option would be something I'd want to consider. The drawback of that is if black mulberry doesn't work, then you have to go back in and plant white mulberry in the spaces where you had those blocks. So if you're experimenting, then you may run into some things that slow down your establishment process. At the same time, if black mulberry doesn't work and you go in and plant white mulberries, you'll know if they work, and the block will be filled in pretty easy. It's easy to do what Javan said, swap things out that aren't working. Another thing I would do is I probably wouldn't interplant the nitrogen fixers in with the mulberries. I might just make a second row of them, and I would see if I could space out the sun trap to just have 3 rows. 1 row of mulberries, 1 row of autumn olives, probably maybe the spacing that they're at, kind of a wide open spacing so I can get in between them easily and just hack at them if I need to. And then 1 row of goji berries, and have the space between that row be something that allows me to move whatever equipment or myself through in between the plants to manage them. And one thing I see right on there that is a cross section I'd want to do is right up along the edge of that blueberry field on the north and west side. That looks really tight. I'd be wondering if I could fit my tractor through or whatever else I'm using to manage and mow and stuff right there in that spot. So I do some more detailed analysis there to make sure that I'm not planting something that's going to get in the way of any machinery or other maintenance, because then I'm creating more work for myself rather than less. And it's not giving me anything except just kind of a headache.
Awesome.
So, yep, those are my main comments on the plant layout. I also really appreciate that they integrated some overall site factors like the ponds, the trees that are already existing, pine trees on the northeast, and the beehives and some other things that aren't just the plant pieces.
And I think this really comes into the idea that there's going to be a lot of back and forth when you're doing design. So this isn't putting an assignment in to be graded and then brought back to you and it was a yay or a nay. There are so many considerations. And in terms of planting, especially when large amounts of capital are involved, you really do want as much back and forth and much input as possible. So for Neil and I to talk about this in the short conversation and to have so many ideas and conversations is actually quite minor compared to some of the scrutiny that I put onto designs and colleagues' designs as they come to me. So keep that in mind as you're going throughout this. It's going to be a longer marathon of sprints. This is definitely more of the classic design for a guild that we see. And I'm going to quickly rattle through some things that Neil and I will be less than happy to comment on all of your assignments about. So please take this to heart. Access, access, access. Can you access and can you maintain? And in this was my biggest conversation with this person. It's very hard to get to the center. It's very hard to get around. It's very hard to get out. There are some major issues. This is more a guild fortification than it is a guild for creation of productivity. There's a big push to include every single layer. Again, 3 layers is more than enough. You do want to have nitrogen fixation at, for me, at least 1 or 2 of these layers. It's nice to have redundancy. If you're creating a perennial or you're creating around a perennial species, it's good to have perennial nitrogen fixation. Good idea there. So good to match up instead of having annual nitrogen fixation to a perennial plant. Lots of good things they did here, though. They gave us good explanations on one slide. On one slide, they did this. Fantastic. Gave us a really good cross-section. Would have been nice to see it, but it's pretty spot on where they did this here. You know, it was basically right across. They gave us some of the foreground, some of the background, which is fine. Very simple. This is one of the ways that I did some of my first designs. Very simple, easy to understand. Gave us some root depths. All of this was exceptional. They could have continued on their vertical access down to give us a sense of the depths down here. But overall, really nice on the presentation. The design considerations was there was definitely room for more nitrogen fixation within this. There was room for access. How are you going to access it? My question then became, how are you going to water and irrigate this? Although we do not ask of that for this assignment. That should be a big consideration for you. Great, I put all these plants together, and then as soon as you get to an irrigation guy, he's going, okay, let's talk about this. And the money you're going to spend on irrigation alone. So do think about the fact that irrigation usually comes in lines, and this idea that, I'll just hand water it, almost never works. Almost never works. Almost 100% never works. I've yet to see a guild like this applied that has been totally and utterly taken care of by hand watering. Now, somebody out there is going to say, I did it. I've done it. Fantastic. I'm stoked for you. I think 99% of the folks out there need to consider what irrigation looks like, even if it's passive. So even if you have a pathway, that pathway is fed by your downspout, that downspout comes into the pathway, which is on some kind of level grade or some kind of off contour. It comes through this system in some way, shape, or form. It then has mulch in it. It's been inoculated by mushrooms, and that's what we're doing. Great. My first question, if you do something like that, because again, we're not taking permaculture items off the shelf. And if Javan says it doesn't become a permaculture item you can grab off the shelf, my question is going to be, what are you going to do when there's no rain? Like, how have you adjusted for that? So if I'm thinking of the Pacific Northwest or the Pacific Southwest, if you're Canadian, you like that, didn't you? How are you going to take care of the 2 to 3 to 4 months of drought? Because that soil's not producing anything. So now you do have to go out there. And I can tell you, during the heat of the summer is the last time you want to go water as a person. It's the best time, of course, for the plants, but as a person, it's hard to get yourself or to coerce somebody else to go out there. So those are all considerations for this one. And again, this is already turning into a very large video. So I'm going to stop and give Neil his time on this one.
Well, I'll riff on the irrigation thing because I think that's critical. If you're in the Northeast U.S., if you're in a climate where you get consistent water monthly through the growing season, then it's not as big of an issue, and you can be more flexible in your plant layouts and stuff. But I did hand water a guild like this for 3 years, and then I built irrigation for it, and I was very happy when I had the irrigation and no longer had to hand water, because it's a lot of work for just a small spot like this, even, right? Like you still got to go out, pull the hose or anything. Anyways, so that's a big consideration. I like Brad Lancaster's motto of plant the ream, then plant the plants. So you may be planning your actual irrigation layout first and then planning your plant layout based on that, or kind of iterating between the two. Here's the general pattern of plantings that I want. Or do I want a windbreak? Do I want alley cropping? Do I want these curvilinear rows that are aligned with contour, so on and so forth? Do I have annual beds that are this size and this big? And then here's how my irrigation plan goes on that. And here I'm going to shift it a little bit to match the irrigation that I can get to build out. So I think that back and forth is a lot of what we're getting at too. It's like the first try is just the first try. Now we have something to talk about. Now we're going to move things around and swap it out. So, get something down, and then we'll work with you to get it good as well. And the access is critical here, right? I mean, you can trample in there and deal with it, but some people don't really like trampling on their flowers when they're flowering. So are you okay with that? Well, you probably won't know until you actually have to do it. And you may just neglect the apple because of that. Or there's a vine growing up it. I can't read what that one is, but how are you going to prune that and your apple tree? I'm not even, ground nut. Okay, so that dies back to the ground every year too. Now you got to pull this thing out of your tree every year. That to me sounds like a pain in the butt, right? Or it's sitting in there becoming a place that harbors disease and insects and water and mold and stuff. So, in the tropics where that's the common pattern, or maybe in the Pacific rainforests where there's a lot of moss or lichen or something growing up trees, then you can match those patterns. But I wouldn't just do it just because, oh, here's a tree, I need to nest a vine somewhere, I'll put the vine in the tree, it's going to be great. Maybe, but a lot of times it just adds more challenge and not more yield necessarily. And yeah, I'm going to just do a second on the access. For this, if I had an apple tree and I wanted to grow some fruiting shrubs around it, I would probably put the shrubs in an arc on one side, depending on how they fit into the bigger pattern. So maybe on the northwest or northeast, kind of to create a little solar bowl around the apple on the outside of that path. And then under the apple, I would focus on just the ground covers. Maybe it's all comfrey under there. That's easy, right? That suppresses grass. It keeps the understory clean and consistent. It has one management method that you can use for all of it at once if you want. Cutting it back and or harvesting it to feed to some animal or something, or you can put an animal in and they can eat it down. But it just makes it simple. You can make a bunch of design choices and management decisions because it's simple. Instead of, oh, well, I don't want to ever let the chickens in under my tree because they might disturb this other thing and this other thing. So now I have to go in and do that work, right? So that's another part of keeping things simple is if you are able to, you need to make access for yourself to do the work you need to do. And if you're able to keep things simple enough, you can put that work onto another element in the system, like the chickens, then that becomes very valuable in your long-term actual management of the site, because all these things are going to take time. Every piece of management takes time. So any way you can do a design to decrease the quantity of management that you have while still retaining the ecological functions and the yields you want, you're going to be of benefit from that relationship. Maybe it's just mint in the understory of the apple. I'd love to have just something very, very simple that fills the need of, creates flowers and habitat, covers the ground, keeps the ground not bare. Maybe it's just mulch under there. Apple mulch with some fruiting hedges around the side, and the mulch is inoculated with fungus. Great. That's simple, easy to manage, easy to keep going, easy to irrigate under, easy to harvest, still fills all the, what I see as the really required functions, which are it provides yield, creates habitat, covers the soil, improves the fertility of the landscape, conserves water use, those sorts of things.
Awesome. So one of the things this individual did is they went onto their next piece and they did a yield analysis, took a look at the plants, put them into real specifics, and brought that out. So again, we can see that putting these plants into scale and seeing where these plants ended up gave us a good sense and helped them understand what and how they might put together. You can put another line column on this, put quantity, then put in price for your local nurseries. Now you start to build a bill of quantities so you can understand what the budget is of this. So use the work that you've done to build upon for some of the requests for the final design, which is a budget, a phasing plan. And they have said this here shortly, but they said successional planning, talked about it a little bit. So something to keep in mind. And
I want to say one more thing kind of on that one. Or
sure.
So the closeness of the plants, that can be appropriate sometimes, like a windbreak planting, for example. You may want to be jamming it because together because you're blocking a sector energy, right?
Yeah.
So we're not saying you always have to have paths between all your plants. What we want you to do is think through the pattern of how you're going to manage it and what the actual needed function is, and make sure that the pattern of the plants fits those other patterns so that all your patterns are in alignment. And one tool that you can use to think through this a bit is the permaculture zone tool. Certain types of guilds will be appropriate in certain zones. You know, your high maintenance and management guilds maybe are applicable in zone 1, which is, you know, why we discussed, you know, at a urban home scale, you know, a tenth of an acre or something, you might just have one little spot for trees and shrubs and stuff. So, okay, great, go with something like that. You have the intensity of management to make that happen. But as soon as you get to, you know, zone 2, zone 3 type of scale, you need to simplify down your guilds dramatically because the scale of management increases.
Yeah, exactly. Last one, really quick. We've seen a lot of really beautiful renders. This is not what I would necessarily call a beautiful render, but it completely gets the point across. So again, I don't want this to be about an art contest. This is about getting the information down, getting it good. That said, my goodness, they've put a lot underneath this tree. So there's lots going on here. And in many ways, what Neil talked about, you know, having one ground cover, you know, having something like white clover, fantastic. But then they went out and they went full sacred geometry on us without any real reason when it comes to access. So patterns rhyme, but they very rarely repeat. So consider that when you have people into these guilds, I would say 50% of these plants would die or become destroyed because there's no way to access this. It's just full plants all the time. And it's really more about the pieces than the specifics. Now, they do a lot of ground cover. So again, there's lots of access in here. So that's not a huge issue. Again, their scale here is not a 1-to-1. I'm not super stoked about that. Everything looks squashed and a little bit flat. Giving us a good render, really simple. Would love to see where this render was on the ground. Would love to see actually where this was on the ground. You know, just a sense of where this might be would have been nice. They generally said this would be around every single one of these apple trees, which we had a long drawn out conversation about, which was, you know, the way this looks in the water here, especially in a place like Calgary, we could, you know, start to converse about what some kind of earthworks would look like here. So that way we plant the water first, and then potentially taking another role and having a role of, you know, small shrubs or nitrogen fixers. They didn't want to take that conversation, which is fine, but it came up anyways, because at the end of the day, we still had an issue here. So something to consider, that we really want to be aware of access. Neil and I are more than happy to tell you access as you give us something like this, but skip all that trouble. Just skip it. Just consider access first and foremost. Think about what you're doing. Think about where it's going. Take a look at Toby's example as a great concept, but in application, and this is why I left this one for last, in application, this is not a gilding classic Toby Hemingway guild. This is more pathways, roads, accessibility, and especially because this is a public park, who's taking care of this? You know, good idea, but who's going to go and do that work? Are the apples in need of anything else? And if they aren't, then maybe your site doesn't require a guild. Not all sites require productive vegetation in the way that we're thinking about it in this way, right? It's really about site specific, as Neil was talking about, case specific. So I think somebody should make you that T-shirt. That should be your T-shirt. Case specific. I love that. Last comments on this one, Neil?
Yeah. So this is totally acceptable to just use PowerPoint circles to do your guild. Mm-hmm. Great. And if you're doing a hedge, use the rectangle or whatever. Just, you know, make it easy on yourself. Don't worry about the details of the rendering or making it beautiful. Think about the design and how you're communicating it visually so that it's easy to understand and discuss and analyze. That's what we're looking for, right? Beautiful is great. And if that's something that you're passionate about, I encourage you to leverage that. But, you know, if you need something beautiful, you can always pay someone to take this and turn it into a rendering too. You know, once you get to the stage where it is actually something you're going to present in a final plan or something like that, or to a funding committee or something. But you want to be able to own that. By own, I mean refine that information quickly, and something like this allows you to do that.
Hmm.
And yeah, just simplify, right? All white clover. You could put the daffodils in to, protect the tree from gophers or something. That's nice because it's offset. It'll be up when the clover's not. Die back, the clover will come up. You can still manage the whole thing by going into there and mowing or something like that. Easy to deal with the management with the, that addition to the guild. But 15 different ground covers. Why not do one ground cover under each apple tree in the orchard instead, right? Make it so that then it's easy to harvest, easy to pick out the pattern. Somebody that comes into the apple tree in the park, the apple tree orchard in the park, can be like, oh, look at this section over here that's full of the strawberries. Oh, over here is the purple coneflower apple tree. And then that also makes it easy to manage, to take care of, to irrigate. It starts to create some set of organizing principles and pattern to the overall orchard, as opposed to just complexity, and I would even say just complicatedness, right? Also, when we're looking at ecological function, having a big patch of strawberries is much more ecologically functional for the insects, for the plants, and all of the other functions that go into it than having 3 strawberries interspersed amongst 50 clovers. It's just not practical for an organism to go in and find that. So you'll find it's hard to harvest, so will other animals. It's difficult to manage. Things are happening at different times that make management difficult. So all those things come into it. If you look at the park as a whole, that, because we're designing wholes in permaculture, not just all these little parts and pieces, right? It does have, pretty substantial set of different guilds. It's got a big open turf area that's a big solar accepting guild. It's got different parts around the perimeter, which have. Can you scroll that slide, Javan? I think it's one up.
The one. This
just
one?
The site. Yeah, the site as a whole. The park, right? So you can see there's some perimeter perennial tall conifer trees. It looks like they've also planted both on the south and also in the northwest. They created almost a solar bowl effect. I would be looking at this apple area as like, how do I enter it? How do I frame it? Maybe if you want to integrate shrubs, you put a hedge around the perimeter, which is now I'm entering the apple guild. It creates a transition from one use space to another. Those sorts of things that are gilding and looking at function according to the whole site and how the patterns fit together beneficially, as opposed to just within one element. And I think that's a big part of what we want you to walk away with, is that the guild concept, all the different layers in the structures, the structural layers, the different heights of the trees and such, as well as the functional layers, nitrogen fixing, insectary, those sorts of things. We want those to happen at the scale of the site and or the management unit, right? We don't need those to happen at the scale of the individual guild or single tree planting. And I hope that kind of allows you to free up your mind and not try to pack everything into one individual unit, but to think about the functionality and the connectedness of the whole site and how it's working together, as opposed to just getting everything working in one small piece of it, or getting all the functions out of one small piece of it. We want them all to work well, but we don't need all the functions out of one small piece.
Great, mate. Great. I think that that wraps up our conversation really well. So for everybody who's watching, guilds is a big conversation. It's something that's really popular in permaculture in application and at scale. You need to change your ideas about it. It's not just one species with every single layer possible underneath. There's multitude of species. Sometimes it's very simple. Sometimes it's blueberries and forbs, and maybe introducing a little bit more nitrogen in clover, because that's what time and money and functionality and production requires. Sometimes it is intense and it's actually about beautification, about demonstration. But remember, for demonstration to demonstrate, it has to demonstrate it well. And so it's not, well, look at all of what you can do. It's look at what works well and what you can access and what you can create. And all of that has a much more profound effect than just a big clutter that is hard to interpret and hard to understand. So again, if your conversation about demonstration, consider legibility, consider literacy on par with demonstration, because without that literacy, the demonstration can't be interpreted. And so you're down to just a small subset of what you wanted to demonstrate. Thanks for being part of this this video, and thanks for being part of the course. I think gilding and vegetative structures, Neil and I could probably do a video a week for the rest of our lives, and we would still just scratch the surface because there are so many incredible systems out there that have done extraordinarily well. But hopefully this gives you a bit of a sense and expands upon the brilliant work of OSU's course, of course, created and added to by Andrew Millison and Marisha Arbuck and a number of us who have played with it. So big props to them for putting this all together, because of course without that there'd be no need for us to talk. Thanks so much. If you did like the video, make sure to give it a big old thumbs up. If you like these series, feel free to subscribe and click the bell, and we'll see you at the next video.